Hello, hello, and I am very, very excited to be joined today by Mark Edlitz, who has just written an absolutely wonderful book, which I have completely devoured and enjoyed. Mark, thank you so much for joining me today.
I'm thrilled to be here. Thank you for having me.
Oh, well, we are here obviously to talk about your latest book, which is coming out December 30th, isn't it? Keeping 007 Alive, which is
It's actually out now. You can get it through Amazon as we speak. Some other outlets are going to take a little while to get to, as you were saying that date is correct. But if people want to get it now through Amazon, it's available.
I'm right there on that page. Well, we're going to talk about that book, but first of all, let's talk about you, because you are quite a multifaceted man. You've got quite an interesting, fascinating history. You're not just somebody who writes books. You started off in film and television, didn't you?
It's true. I did. My backstory is went to NYU Film School, made a couple of films. I made a documentary on extreme Star Wars fans called Jedi Junkies that was on Hulu and Netflix, and that was pretty cool. And I've done a lot of work on TV as well, National Geographic, NBC Universal, ABC News, different shows for these different companies. And yeah.
I remember The Big Picture with Cal Penn because I was a huge Cal Penn fan from Harold and Kumar Get the Munchies. Then he went to House, and I loved him as a character in House. And then he went to the big White House and got involved in politics and stuff like that. So I really enjoyed that show. And it's like, oh my God, Mark was a writer for that. That's incredible. So how did you get into writing books? And obviously, you're not just a James Bond author. I mean, you've written some fantastic books. You've got The Ages of the Avengers, Movies Go Forth, How to Be a Superhero. So you've got a lot of books about not just James Bond. You just happen to sort of, in recent years, narrow it into James Bond.
Yeah, my first book, as you're saying, was called How to Be a Superhero, and that was interviews with actors who played superheroes for the last 7 decades or so. But it wasn't always the first person that you would think of. So for Spider-Man, instead of Tobey Maguire, it was Nicholas Hammond who played it in the 70s on TV. For Captain America, it wasn't Chris Evans. It was Matt Salinger who played it in the feature film that in the wake of 1989's Tim Burton's Batman. So I would track down all these superheroes and basically find out what it was like to be a superhero. And I crammed in a little James Bond in there, even though it didn't technically belong, but no one called me on it. And I decided that I had a Bond book in me, and that Bond book was The Many Lives of James Bond. And that was, among other things, interviews with actors who played James Bond in different media, including film, TV, on the Oscars dance, Academy Award salute to Cubby Broccoli, video games, audio dramas, and I interviewed a bunch of Bond screenwriters and directors for that. Anyway, so that was my second book. And then sort of in between other books that are not Bond related, I've written about Bond. My last book, as you were just saying, was called Movies Go Forth. And that was looking at the 4th films in popular series. So the 4th Star Wars, the 4th Star Trek, the 4th Batman, etc. You name a popular series, and I probably included in the book. And it wasn't just me and my crazy ideas, although there's plenty of me and my crazy ideas in them, including the weird concept for the book. But I also interviewed like it was always interviews with a primary filmmaker on it. So for Batman, it was Joel Schumacher. For Superman 4, it was the writer. And I sort of backed up into that because I've always been fascinated by Jaws 4, Batman 4, Batman and Robin, and Superman 4, the quest for peace. Whenever you make a list of the worst films of all time, those 3 films show up on it, perhaps unfairly, but they do show up on them. And so I noticed the pattern, and it gave me an excuse to talk to cool filmmakers.
I think I read a quote from Michael Caine in one of your books, which was he thought Jaws 4 was a terrible movie, but it bought a lovely house.
Yes, exactly. So yeah, that talked all about the art and commerce of making it, and how, you know, trilogies used to be the sign of a successful film franchise. And a trilogy, as you know, is a perfect form of storytelling because it's a beginning, middle, and end. And for the fourth film, where do you go when the story is over and you want to tell more stories? And what is the conflict between the art and the commerce of it all?
I find that fascinating. I mean, that's what I love. You kind of like explore lost media in a way. I mean, the first book of yours I read about James Bond was The Lost Adventures of James Bond, and it was kind of like, what if Timothy Dalton still kept making movies?
Yes, yes.
And some of the ideas there were wild, like cowboys and
Yes, yeah. Bond goes to a rodeo and disguises himself as a cowboy, and then Pat Carbajal illustrated what Timothy Dalton's Bond would look like with a cowboy hat, which is delightful. But yes, I love lost media. I love that you picked it up. It's one of my fascinations for movies go forth. I didn't know that there was a Porky's 4 before I started writing the book, and I didn't know that there was a Meatballs 4 before writing the book. And the thing about Porky's 4, which is not even called Porky's 4 when it was first came out, it had another title. Is that it's called I'm gonna mangle it, a ash can piece. So it's a film property that is a story that is made, a movie that is made before the rights revert back to the owner of those stories. So in the case of Porky's 4, they were about to lose the rights, and they hired someone to write it, like, you know, in a week and shoot it in a couple of weeks. And I love to learn about the conditions on which art is created. Your cat. And how that framework for this art exists within practical considerations.
I mean,
holders, yeah.
I find that fascinating. Like, I know Warren Beatty, every 20 years or so, he makes a direct-to-TV movie, which is an interview with Dick Tracy, so he doesn't lose the rights.
Exactly. So, yeah.
That's okay. So you started off with superheroes and things, and you went into James Bond. Where does your love affair with James Bond begin, and why did you kind of like focus in on him?
I've been a Bond fan since my dad and mom took me to see Moonraker in 1979. I loved it and quickly became a Roger Moore is my guy, James Bond kind of fan. This was a time when there were only 2 Bonds. People forgot about Lazenby, media wasn't always as readily available. You know when I met 13, there's the VHS tape of Octopussy was like roughly $100, you know, $90, $100. So it wasn't as easy as accessible as it is today. And you had to wait for ABC's Saturday or Sunday night movie to catch it and record it on VHS tape, and it was all edited, but I didn't care. I still loved it.
Yeah, I remember I had The Man with the Golden Gun, and then it would have the advertisement breaks. And I remember watching it 10 years later with like advertisement breaks for all these companies that didn't exist anymore and stuff like that. And so Moonraker, I'm a Roger Moore fan myself. I think you and I are probably like of the same age, and that was the James Bond we grew up with. So, right. Well, talking about, I find it so interesting that you're so involved in television and film, because what I loved was James Bond after Fleming, the continuation novels, because I'm super about the books. And yes. Obviously, everyone focuses on the Ian Fleming James Bond books, but one of the things is that's not where James Bond's adventures finished. I mean, then you had Kingsley Amis and John Pearson and John Gardner and Raymond Benson and all these other people writing continuation novels. And you wrote the Bible of continuation novels. It was everything, like super, super inclusive. Look how thick it is. Look. Beautiful cover as well.
That's Sean Longmore. Yeah, it's a big fat book where I go into every single James Bond continuation novel, novelization, and short story, including short stories that I don't think most Bond fans know. I mean, most Bond we should go into the history. We should briefly go into the history of why continuation novels exist in the first place. But there's even short stories that the average Bond fan doesn't know, and I certainly didn't know before I started writing it. We're familiar with Raymond Benson's, but William Boyd wrote 2 short stories to coincide with the release of his continuation novel, and it has a time travel element where the premise of these short stories is that William Boyd goes back in time to interview James Bond. So these are official stories, and we could take them as, I think, what Raymond Benson calls apocryphal, which is how he describes his, Bond goes to Playboy Mansion, where you have an authorized writer having a little fun with the story, and we just saying, take it for what it is. Don't take it too seriously, but it's a Bond story, and in that case, it's in Playboy, and I hope you enjoy it.
Yeah, and I actually remember buying the Playboy to get that story.
Yes, yeah.
So, well, I mean, that's fascinating because, yeah, you were about to mention why the continuation novels existed, which is something your fascinating interview with Corinne actually goes into. But tell me a bit about that. Like, Ian Fleming passed away. I know Anne Fleming didn't necessarily want anyone to continue, and then what happened?
So Fleming passes away. Anne Fleming says, I think we're done with it. I've never liked the Bond books per se, but they're Fleming's personal work. They come from him. It'd be disrespectful to continue having another writer write his work. And she has a good point. We're more familiar with that today. With George Lucas is no longer the creator of Star Wars. He's someone that you just used to know, but it was his baby, and it is no longer. And so she had a fair point. Maybe it's time to put the literary Bond to bed. But different things were going on at that same time. One, there were copyright attacks on the character, where people who were going to just write their own Bond novels without seeking permission. And so they needed to, and then simultaneously, Jeffrey Jenkins said, Fleming gave me the support to write this book. I'm writing it. So there were, and in order to protect the copyright and frankly for income, they decided to continue telling Bond stories in print. And one of Anne Fleming's requirements of them was that the board would have to read the manuscript when it was completed, and if they didn't like it, it didn't get published. And that's exactly what happened with Jenkins, is that they gave him a contract to write it, which he seemed to want to do anyway, and they got it, and they said, this is not up to our standards. And they put that to the side. They put that in the drawer. They didn't put it in a drawer. They returned it as per his contract. And he's, as many fans know, he doesn't seem to have the entire manuscript, and it's lost. So there's that. But the first James Bond continuation novel is not Kingsley Amos's Colonel's Son. It's the spinoff, Bond spinoff, 003, the Adventures of James Bond Jr.
Which I didn't know until I'd read your book, and I thought I knew stuff. I was like, what?
Yeah, it's crazy. It's the first, obviously, everyone thinks of it as Colonel's Son, but it predated it. It was the first post-Fleming official Bond novel or spin-off novel. One of the things that and I'm using these terms now because they're young Bond, you could call it a spin-off, or you could call it a prequel. Moneypenny or Kim Sherwood, you could call them spin-off novels. You could one correctly refers to Chris Wood's Bond novelizations as that novelizations, which is stories from the film translated to book form. But I don't rank them in terms of one's more important than the other. everything gets in James Bond after Fleming, every book, every short story, every novelization gets its own chapter and gets its own weight. And if you're a fan, you might like one thing more than the other. But I didn't want to dismiss anyone's novelizations just because they're novelizations. And I know that they're written under different contracts and they're written faster under a shorter time constraint. And sometimes there's more or less discretion or interest in veering from the, Benson put his own stamp on it. Christopher Wood, his first one, The Spy Who Loved Me, is his screenplay, but with a Fleming lens. Anyway, my point is, and the books are often smaller. Like if you have Benson's novelizations, they're physically smaller than his book. And so it gives the impression of being less important. And if you're putting them on your bookshelf, you might separate them because it's not as aesthetic to have books going up and down. That's not how collectors often do their work, not all, but some. And so it looks like it's less important, and you might like it more or less. But let's give all this work the weight it deserves. I'm going to take a breath now.
Well, it's funny you said that. Christopher Wood's books, his two books, The Spy Who Loved Me and Moonraker. I mean, I remember reading Moonraker, and I was like, this is a bloody good book. It's like, this is almost, in some way, I mean, we love the film, but in some ways, this is like a better story than the film because it's more complete and it ties in with Fleming and it's tighter.
Yeah, I feel like he had an original Bond novel in him.
Yeah,
and I would have liked to have read it. Yeah.
That's the amazing thing. Okay, so moving on to Keeping 007 Alive. I was so excited about this because, it was amazing to read James Bond after Fleming, have basically the Bible of that. But you actually went to every surviving continuation novel author. Yeah, look at that. Oh, Sean Longmore.
Sean Longmore.
He is so insanely talented.
Like Pat Carbajal. Sorry. He's great. Yes, he's absolutely great. Yeah.
It was amazing because you had covered the full gamut, and then to actually speak to the authors. So, first of all, that's an incredible achievement,
right?
Yeah, it really is.
So I was nearly done with the first book, James Bond After Fleming, and I didn't intend to write Keeping 007 Alive. Oh, so just to set it up, Keeping 007 Alive is interviews with all the authors of all the living authors of the Bond continuation novels, plus Simon Gardner, John's son, and Corinne Turner, managing director of IFP. So that's Keeping 007 Alive. Okay, so I was nearly done with the first book, James Bond After Fleming, and I told my uncle what I was doing. My uncle's very supportive. He's also an excellent editor, and anyway, he's like, "Oh, is it going to include any interviews with the Bond authors?" And I was like, "No, but what an excellent idea." So I for the first one, I intentionally didn't speak to authors. I wanted it to just be my reaction to the work, not colored by the facts, but like, what's actually on each individual page. But for Keeping 007 Alive, I was like, well, I'm going to try to interview all the authors, and 3 or 4 of them are no doubt going to tell me no. It's not going to be possible to get every living Bond author. They don't benefit in any way by talking to me about their books. In many cases are in their catalog, meaning they're in their rear view mirror. So they don't get anything out of it. But they all said yes, which was shocking and absolutely delightful.
And because I'm a writer myself, obviously, and I love looking into the heads of other writers and their process and what brought them to it. And then, of course, there's a lens of James Bond, because we all love James Bond. Part of what I write is so influenced by James Bond. It's so weird to go the other way around and write and talk to authors who write great books and how they got into James Bond. Like I was lucky enough to speak to Raymond Benson, and he's a terrific writer right off the bat. I just read his last book, The Mad Mad Murders of Marigold Way, and I was like, this is a legitimately amazing mystery novel.
That's how I feel. And the thing about Raymond, and I'm almost certain you mentioned this to him in your interview with him, is that was his first published novel. He did previously write a novel. I thought it was his first book ever, but in his interview, he corrected me to get it accurate, and that he had written another book, gave it to oh, I'm going up on his name on I see what he looks like, who previously ran IFP, and he said, oh, you know, he didn't think it was the other guy didn't think it was ready to be published, but it did give him an idea of who Benson was as a writer. Anyway, Benson was a first-time writer when he, excuse the long segue. It was a first-time writer when he wrote his first Bond book, which is an amazing and scary shoes to step in, I think.
Yeah, I mean that's one of the things that I always found so surprising is sometimes IFP seems to make what you might think of like safe decisions, like getting Charlie Higson to write On His Majesty's Secret Service or getting Anthony Horowitz to write the period Bond books. And then, yeah, Raymond Benson hadn't written a published book before, and they were like, take over from John Gardner, and he did an amazing job. And I think it really he was the one who gave like literary Bond and continuation novels like their legitimacy again. But also Kim Sherwood. I mean, I read her first book, Testament, which I thought was amazing, and it made me cry. But I mean, for IFP to be like, we're going to take this young woman, and she's going to write the next James Bond book. She's only written one book before, and she's going to do some really interesting new things. That's such a bold strategy to take.
Yeah. So I asked. There's a bunch of categories that all these questions that responding to what you're saying fall into. I guess there are 5 major buckets for each of the interviews. Oh, Peter Jansen Smith. He was, of course, Fleming's agent and ran IFP and was the mentor to Corinne Turner. Sorry, I had a clear that from my brain cobwebs. So there's
you're doing a weave.
Yes, we're doing a weave. There's buckets that the questions fall into, which is how to select the author, how the author crafts their story, what the authors take from Fleming or Leave, what the authors take from each other, and sort of the writing and editing and launch of the book, and then fan reaction. So that's 5 or 6 different broad categories, and we go through each novel or short story that they've written. We just go through everything and ask all my silly questions to every author. Anyway, so one of the things I learned is, in responding to what you just said about period Bond versus contemporary Bond, is that was one of my questions. How is this decided, period versus contemporary? How is it decided to write a book at the last minute with Charlie Higson? So let's do the period versus contemporary, because that's just one of the big questions that I've always wondered about. And when we go to the 3 one-shots of Falk, Sebastian, William Boyd, and Deaver.
Yeah.
The first one is period. The second one is contemporary, and the third one is period again. And so you go, what happened there? Why is it a little bit seemingly from an outsider all over the place? And in each case, it was what the author wanted. It's what when IFP approached the author, they said, "What would you like to do? What interests you?" And in each case, that was the answer. It might have been a condition for the first one because he had to write in the style of Fleming, but Boyd wanted to write a period piece. Deaver, I don't want to say insisted, because everything is a dialogue and nothing is intended to be, this is my position, this is IFP's position. Everything is in dialogue with each other. But in Deaver's case, it was important for him to write a contemporary one because he said he wanted to avoid speed bumps. So if he's writing something and Bond has to go and find coins out of his pocket and go to a phone booth or whatever. He calls that a speed bump for the reader. And he said, I didn't want to have any of those for the reader. Fleming's books were contemporary to his time. Let me write something contemporary to my time. And the other thing about Deaver's book is that it doesn't involve any knowledge of any of the other Bond books at all, even truly Fleming's, because he sort of wipes the table clean and writes what could have been the first Bond book.
Yes.
Yeah.
I really enjoyed Jeffrey Deaver books. I mean, he's a wonderful, wonderful writer, and he's like created such an iconic character of his own right. But it was almost like it was almost like not reading a James Bond book, because he had to recreate the biography of James Bond in order to fit him into a contemporary setting, which I found so interesting. When Charlie Higson wrote on His Majesty's Secret Service, he was so deft in just sidestepping that. He's like, this is James Bond, he's contemporary, and we can just avoid going into his biography and avoid all those questions.
Yeah, and that's what you just identified as something that the author must face when deciding period versus contemporary. Because what do? Do you do something? I think Bill Koenig on the Spy Command might call it like a slip in time, or a time slip, where you just you pretend everything happened, but just a little bit later than it did in the books. But that's what you have to do when you're faced with that decision, and then you have to back up into, like Charlie Higson, if he's writing contemporary, he's like, well, if Bond is X years old, that means when was he born? And it's like, oh my goodness, is he a millennial?
Yeah, absolutely. It's like, damn, Bond's younger than me now. Talking to the authors, I thought was so fascinating as well, because the challenges they faced. I mean, I don't know about would you ever like to write a James Bond book? So
I think everybody fantasizes about it. And then, when you read these interviews, you'll see how demanding it is. You've got lots of different people to please, lots of different factions to please. IFP, the family, the American publisher, the English publisher, the general public who will pick up a Bond book at the airport, and us lunatic fans who've read or collected them all. And it's like, that's a lot of people and themselves.
Yeah.
Oh, and their own readers. That's something that some of them say, that they wanted it to be a book that would also please their audience, and we're a demanding group, the Bond fans. So it's a daunting task, in my opinion.
Absolutely. I mean, there's a wonderful chap, Caleb Daniels, who I was chatting to, who grew up on the Alex Rider books. And so imagine when he reads the Anthony Horowitz books, it's like Anthony Horowitz does not just have to appeal to James Bond fans, but he has to appeal to James Bond fans who deliberately came there because of Alex Rider.
Yes. And then, are you writing for the Bond movie? So you're writing for the Bond movie fans, who are more people than the Bond literary fans. Are you writing for the Bond literary? There's a lot, even within the Bond community. There's a difference between people's interests. Yeah.
I thought one of the things that I was so interesting to read your interview with Kim Sherwood. One of the things that she did that was genius, I think, conceptually, was she's going to write a trilogy of books in which James Bond is missing. And it's kind of like there's so much pressure of you're a new author, you come in, you're different, you're doing something different, you're bringing in all of these different elements which might cause friction with some of the hardcore James Bond fans. And to just come up with that concept of taking James Bond out and focusing on 3 new characters, I thought was just genius. And it's so interesting to read about the process she went through coming up with that as an idea.
Yes, because she would, when she was approached, I believe she was told to keep it contemporary, but she said that in terms of Bond's status, he could. That was up to her to figure it out, how to incorporate or not incorporate Bond into the book, and she made him, the MacGuffin. And then the other thing she did, which was super smart, which I'm gonna a little bit mangle in her strategy, was she had each of the main characters have a unique but meaningful relationship with Bond. And so the idea was, if if that character was interested in Bond and Bond cared about that character, then us, the reader, would care about that character too. And it's like that's like a great, thoughtful idea on how to approach something conceptually. And her book is thick, but it also needs to be, because she's introducing an entire world. She's setting up, this large cast of characters, and she doesn't have the I don't want the nostalgia, or goodwill might not be the best word for it, but without Bond, if you could start, any other author who writes a Bond novel could write James Bond went to the zoo, and you're already with James Bond.
Yeah.
But if you do another character who's not James Bond, the author has to work for the reader's interest and compassion for that character. And so she needed a little space to do it.
Your interview with Charlie Higson, I thought, was fascinating along those same lines, because Charlie Higson said, one of the benefits for Ian Fleming was he could cut out the first half of the thriller, because James Bond walks into M's office and gets told, this is the bad guy, go and deal with it. Whereas when he wrote the Young Bond books, he had to create that world, do some world building, and just Kim Sherwood also had to do that world building, which is something that not all writers have had to be challenged with.
Yeah, that was one of the things. It's like, how many adventures could young Bond plausibly go into just by chance? I'm sorry, does that little beeping, do you hear that? No,
I don't.
Okay,
actually.
Good. Sorry about that.
That's a bomb under your desk.
What's that?
That's the bomb under your desk.
Oh no. How many times could young Bond James just come into an adventure on his own at school? How many times is that plausible before that's just silly, maddening idea? And then he, in his last book, had an idea where to make Bond young Bond an asset, not a spy, but an asset. And then Steve Cole decided not to use that thread, and instead, it's more, young Bond finds adventure by chance. But I agree with you that was that great idea that Fleming had, that Higson identified. Just give Bond the mission. Just have a guy say, "Here's your mission," and you don't have to. It just cuts out all that Act One stuff that can be boring.
I thought your interview with Simon Gardner was really fascinating, where maybe it was Corinne who'd mentioned actually that has the movies have Sean Connery and then Roger Moore, and they're different phases, and in some ways the books have the Fleming book is the Sean Connery, and then the John Gardner with the Roger Moore books kind of, and then Raymond Benson came in as the Pierce Brosnan. Do you think James Bond's literary legitimacy has increased? I would say that people might have passed a blind eye to the John Gardner books. They were just your paperbacks you read at the airport and stuff. I think Raymond Benson kind of added some real literary legitimacy to it. And then when you got Sebastian Faulks and Anthony Horowitz and William Boyd in there, I mean, those are big name legitimate writers. Jeffrey Deaver is a powerhouse in terms of the he writes.
Yes, I mean, I think that's been a strategy on IFP's part, where they've, I know fans sometimes want more than we're given, and a Bond book a year would be great, but that's not always that's not any more practical than a Bond movie a year every 2 years as it used to be. There has to be a rhythm to the publishing cycle, but I think that IFP has been fairly nimble in changing strategies as they go to keep Bond in print for as long as they have. I think if they didn't, if it was always the same kind of book or the same kind of author, it might not have lasted this long as it did, as they've done.
Yeah, Calvin Dyson went through all of the John Gardner books and read them all, and I was kind of I'm happy to go and reread all the Raymond Benson books. I'd do that in a heartbeat, but the John Gardner books, I was like, that's quite an undertaking you're going through there. Some of those get pretty wild.
Gardner was given, more leeway than any other Bond author. I'm going to say before or since. Gardner, you know, he had different phases. Some of them, you know, are completely wacky. Um, but sometimes he tried to write like a pure Fleming-ish book. Sometimes he wrote a book that was more satirical. And he had different phases of writing. And yeah.
I thought it was fascinating how we learned about, you know, when John Gardner was writing the books, he couldn't use the word, or the British publishers wouldn't let him reference AIDS, for example, which is a massive thing. And he was like, maybe James Bond should have his own brand of condoms with the 3 gold rings on and stuff. And it was interesting to look at contemporary history, how it affected those books, because I think we kind of forget and we gloss over with Anthony Horowitz and Sebastian Faulks writing period books that James Bond was achingly contemporary at the time. And so
Bill Cannon, so obviously couldn't interview Gardner himself, but that's why I spoke to his son. But Bond fan Bill Canis wrote Gardner a note and asked him some questions about all that, and Bill let me print that letter in the book. It's, you know, it's like a page and a quarter of the letter, but it goes into, you know, Gardner's thought process about how his approach to the books, and, you know, where he might have gone next. Yeah.
I loved that. I love the way that John Gardner opened up that letter with, this is going to be a short letter because my time is extremely short. And then he writes a page and a half. Like, my parents haven't got a letter like that from me in years.
Yeah, he jams it with useful, like, boom, boom, boom. Here's my thoughts about Bond and what I did with him and where I'd go with him. It's just like, it's a great letter. And Bill was very nice to let me print it in the book.
And I really enjoyed how Raymond Benson, a lot of his books were, I mean, his first book, 0-10, was about the handover of Hong Kong. I mean, that's as relevant as you can possibly get. Jeffrey Deaver, I seem to remember there was the whole subplot with the shredding of the data and like data retention. That was something that was very, very relevant at the time. And then Kim Sherwood goes into like climate change and things like that, which is something and I think that's an important and overlooked aspect of the James Bond books, perhaps.
Yeah, and it's tough. You know, that's something that they do with the movies as well, where they try to think, well, what's the problem, you know, 20 minutes from now, as opposed to today. What will also, you know, the idea of 20 minutes from now is what will still be relevant by the time we create this movie and put it out, or write this book and put it out 2 years later. And that will sit on the shelf well, where the concept won't date too much. You know, the Charlie Higson's one is the most, him and Benson, I guess. Maybe I'm gonna be wrong about this as I say it, but I was going to say they're the ones that are most timed to a specific point in time. You know, climate change or data is something that, you know, it could be a few years here, a few years there, but the handover 0-10 and then on His Majesty's Secret Service are tied to just like, here's a date that this story takes place in history. Yeah.
And I mentioned earlier how IFP can be incredibly like bold in the choices they made. I mean, on His Majesty's Secret Service, it's just, I love it because I was so excited when IFP became like their own independent publishing house.
Yeah, I remember.
Champion independent.
Yeah, I remember you did a whole bunch of videos for that. Yeah.
And it's just like the audacity to be like, okay, we're going to have a book and it's going to be out for the coronation. We're going to get it written in 4 weeks. Call up Charlie Higson. We're not going to pay you. I loved that in the interview as well, when you found out we're going to avoid all the negotiations by just not paying you. And he was like, I'll do it. And then he wrote it. I mean, what a thing. You cannot imagine Simon and Schuster or Hodder and Slaughter doing that.
Right. I mean, it's an amazing moment of where we are in publishing and where IFP is in taking ownership of complete ownership. Oh, they still have partners for other books, and they said that they want to. IFP will bid for the authors, the upcoming authors' book, because they want to represent them just as well as if they went with a publishing partner. But
yeah,
But it's amazing that, that IFP was like, hey, we're going to do a Bond novella, which they've never done before. And it just came together like that. And that's nimble, that's incredible that they pulled it together so quickly. And the thing about that is everyone wanted Charlie Higson to write an adult Bond story. And no one would have put it on their bingo card, contemporary Bond, yet it's not something that we, the fans, knew that we wanted. But once we got, we're like, oh, this is so cool.
Yeah. And it was amazing reading the interview with Corinne, where she was like, she thought of the concept in February of that year. And then it was out in bookstores by May. Speaking about that, because I know we're running out of time, but I got some things I'm dying to ask you about. I loved your interview with Corinne. I found that absolutely fascinating, because I don't think IFP even know who I am. If they do know who I am, they're probably like, it's that annoying guy who went on so much about censoring the books. And I noticed you didn't go into that at all when you interviewed her. Was that a deliberate thing, or did that just...
Well, no, I didn't go into it because my conversations were about the continuation novels, not Fleming's novels. So it felt not that's my answer, is that I was concentrating exclusively on the continuation novels.
I have to admit, I read the interview with Corinne and I was like, oh, I get where they're coming from now, because you started to understand the motivations and the plans of IFP in a way. I'm an annoying, tedious, middle-aged white Bond fan. So of course I want, oh, you can't edit James Bond books. But you realize that when IFP talk about keeping Fleming's legacy alive, that is through continuation novels, because I have probably 5 copies of every single Fleming book. So I don't need to buy new ones that much, but the continuation novels, I snap them straight up. So you see the burden they have.
Yeah, that's one of the things that I got from my conversation with her, is that the continuation novels, IFP's mission is to preserve Fleming's legacy.
Yeah,
that means that does mean publishing his Bond novels, but it also just as much means keeping the character alive through these continuation novels. And that is how they view the purpose and function of these continuation novels, in addition to making money, because they are they're a business and they need to make decisions that keep them in business. Otherwise their mission of preserving Fleming doesn't work if they are out of business. But that's one of the things that they kept on getting hammered home, and that I walked away with the most of from one of the things that was this idea of, we're publishing these continuation novels to preserve Fleming's legacy. That's why we do it.
And Corinne mentioned specifically bringing in new readers. And yes, I was thinking that because, you could write the same stuff and you're always appealing to the same demographic. But one of the things about Kim Sherwood's books that was so fascinating is I know, and that it didn't land with all James Bond fans, but there were some James Bond fans it landed immensely with, like David Lowbridge-Ellis from License to Quit. He was like raving about this book. And it was so interesting that the people who the book didn't land with, maybe it wasn't written for them. Because maybe there is a new generation of James Bond fans and a whole new demographic of James Bond fans who, if you took the original 1954 British edition of Live and Let Die and you gave it to my son and said, read this book, he'd be like, Dad, do you know what the chapter 6 is called? And so I can understand now that it's like, you don't want to rewrite an author's original words, but at the same time, I might be okay with that because I come from a generation where we had, very politically incorrect television and stuff. My son wouldn't be. And so if I want him to be into James Bond, you have to I don't know, it's complicated.
Yeah, it is very complicated. And the idea is that they need to bring more people into the tent. They can't just exclusively tell Bond stories just for the existing fans. They've got to widen their base and their readership, and not all, as you're saying, not every single Bond book is necessarily written for every Bond fan. And if you don't like it, don't read it, or put it aside, or read it and say, oh, I didn't like it. But the idea is to attract more people to Bond and Fleming's work by extension.
Yeah, and I'm really excited about Vasim Khan's trilogy of books coming out. Have you spoken to him yet?
No. Hopefully I will at a later date. Yeah.
Yeah, because I immediately picked up his books and I was like, he is a terrific writer. And then you study his background, you know, like this is the guy who's going to be perfect for the Q things. And that's, again, like bringing in a whole new audience of people.
Yeah, and then you know, just as you're talking, it reminded me of something that Kim Sherwood said about she wasn't trying. There's plenty of Bond references, deep cuts in her novel, but in terms of writing style, she was not imitating Fleming. In terms of writing structure, she was not trying to imitate Fleming. Her sentences are much longer, as she's aware, than Fleming, and the Bond narrative with Fleming is much more straightforward. Not to say that Bond doesn't go through reversals and twists and turns, but it's a single hero. You know, most of the time it's a single hero. Most of the time. I don't mean he doesn't have partners. I mean, it's his story, and she's telling a story with more characters. So she's trying to even structurally try something new.
Yeah, I found that fascinating. I've also found it fascinating hearing about the authors and the reactions their books got, which was interesting. And I mean, I think Kim, it was, I think was the one that like I sat there, I got a little lump in my throat when it's like, you know, obviously there were people who didn't embrace her books in the ways like Anthony Horwich's books were, but then of course there were the people who embraced them in a completely different way. But it's kind of interesting to think there is this thing, we as fans, like we grab books and we read them and we react to them, and you think there are authors who poured like their whole so much of themselves into these books, and it's so fascinating to read Keeping 007 Alive, because you understand just how much of them went into these books. And
I mean that's I mean that's one of the I'm glad you said that, because that's one of the most important parts of the book to me. Is I'm not trying to convince anyone to like a book that they don't like. You know, you like what you like, and that's what it is. But I do hope that it gives readers more understanding and even empathy for what they're trying to achieve and the way that they try to achieve it. And maybe someone will reread the book with the information in mind of of all their thought. Maybe someone will pick up the Keeping 007 Alive, read an interview with so-and-so, go, oh, that's what they were doing. And maybe maybe go back and dip into it again and see what they think this time.
Absolutely. So my final question for you, what was it like working with IFP? Have they supported you with your James Bond books? Have they just let you do it? What's the relationship there?
I don't really have a relationship with IFP. You know, I obviously interviewed Corinne for this book. I don't. So yeah, I don't.
Your interview with Raymond Benson, I thought was fascinating, because he was writing the James Bond bedside companion, and they were like, "No, you can't do this. We don't want any part of this." And then they read it and were like, "Oh, actually, okay, come on, let's bring it in." And I'm just
right, yeah. And in that case, he was quoting large passages from Fleming and needed partnership, needed permission. Yeah. In this case, this is just more of like a scholarly approach and appreciation. My hope and belief and wish is that they understand that these are love letters and testaments to their authors and their work. And
I think that comes across in spades. And I mean, the fact that you got Corinne Turner to actually speak to you obviously goes some way. But
I felt very, very lucky, because she's someone whose work I've been, you know, whenever you open a Bond novel, continuation novel, you know, you see her name in there. You know, she's been doing this for such a long time, and she's been such a huge part of getting these authors selected, and you know, with the team, now working with Simon Ward. But so I was very lucky, and I feel privileged to speak to her and these authors who were lucky enough, who I was lucky enough to listen to them share their hopes, beliefs, and dreams and processes with me.
I mean, I will say Keeping 007 Alive to me improves the experience of every single continuation novel. Like
Oh, that's lovely. That's
I
lovely
love
to
it.
hear. Thank you. Thank you.
They mean more to me now because you gave me a window into the minds of the people who wrote them, which I think is such a privilege for a reader to get the opportunity to.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. That's beautiful. Thank you.
So I'm going to wrap things up, but Mark, where can everyone find out more about you, and what are you up to next? What's your next book?
Please get the book. Anyone who's made it this far, it's available. I'm on Twitter or X and Blue Sky. The book's available on Amazon and hopefully where other books are sold. If you have made it this far, if you could please give the book a 5-star review. One can't underscore how important that is in getting people aware. These are, small books, not with a big force of, Simon and Schuster or anyone like that. So I really rely on word of mouth, and I'm very grateful for anyone who reads the book and takes a chance on it.
Absolutely. Well, my review will be going up later today, and it will be 5-star because it very much deserves it. So, Mark, thank you so much for taking the time to speak to me. It is a wonderful, wonderful book, and I'm so excited that it exists. And I'm so excited that you took the initiative and the time and the effort to write it for us.
And I'm also very happy to speak with you. Thanks, Roland. Thanks, buddy.
Well, I will sign off now, but I'll obviously pop links to that book down there. Make sure you check it out, and hopefully this is not the last time I speak to you, Mark.